Thank you for joining the second of two events on problems with American democracy and the role the business community can have in pursuing political reforms. I'm Didi Kuo, the Associate Director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. Our event today is co-sponsored with the Stanford Graduate School of Business, Corporations, and Society Initiative and the Leadership Now Project. We thank you all for joining us, and we're looking forward to a vibrant session. So last week we had a great session on the problems with American democracy and different options for reform. Today we continue our discussion of the reforms that are on the table, but also hone in on whether or not business can help strengthen democracy, and if so, how. We'll start by hearing from our three distinguished panelists, who I'll introduce in just a second. They'll each speak for about 10 minutes, and we'll then engage them in a discussion for a few minutes based on questions from the audience and poll results that we'll be running during the course of this event. First, we have Myrna Perez, the director of the Brennan Center for Justice's Voting Rights and Election Program, who has testified before Congress and state legislatures on voting rights and is an expert on various reforms, including HR 1. Larry Diamond is next. He's a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University, as well as a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute. He is an expert on democracy and on political reform. And finally, we have Anoop Prakash, who is division president of the Rev Group, and he leads the Wisconsin chapter of Leadership Now, which is a membership organization of business and thought leaders committed to fixing American democracy. We'll go ahead and start our program now with Myrna.
Buenas noches, I'm Myrna Perez. I am director of the Brennan Center's Voting Rights and Elections Program. I'm excited to be speaking with you. The topic is pretty broad, and generally speaking, I tend to not talk about solutions or reforms until we're able to lay out the problem, because I think solutions and problems should be related to each other. So I think I want to talk about three particular problems that we're experiencing right now. One is a state in our democracy where we have weakened federal protections against voting rights. Another where we are seeing a widespread backlash in states across the country against voting rights. And the third is a lot of lies about voter fraud and a lot of misinformation and disinformation. So first I want to talk about weakened federal protections. The federal government has a role pursuant to the Constitution for setting guidelines and standards for federal elections. Certainly some powers are reserved to the states, and certainly states administer our elections. States also have specific responsibilities and specific roles with respect to state elections. Now, the question about what Congress can do is one that wasn't particularly contested for a very long period of time, but has gotten more contested as of late. Because in addition to what we call the Elections Clause, there's also Congress's authority under the 14th and the 15th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is obviously the one that we talk about in terms of equal protection, and the 15th Amendment is the one that sets forth that Americans are free from racial discrimination when they step into the ballot box, and Congress should take the authority to enforce them. So pursuant to those two are those sources of those sources of authority, those coming from the Election Clause and those coming from the Reconstruction Amendments, Congress has been regulating in elections in quite a number of ways. One of the big ways that Congress regulated was through the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act has been the crown jewel of the civil rights movement. It set forth a number of protections for voters. I like to talk about the Voting Rights Act as a way of making good on the promise that this country made through the 15th Amendment, that when you step into the ballot box, it doesn't matter the color of your skin or where you are from or what race or nationality you hail from. And through the Voting Rights Act, there were quite a number of provisions. One of them was called Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and that was sometimes called the preclearance provision. And preclearance is just like a fancy lawyer term for the idea that before you make a change, you need to get clearance in advance that the change you're trying to make in an election wasn't going to make communities of color, voters of color, worse off, or wasn't enacted with the purpose of trying to make voters of color worse off. And throughout the country, a number of different localities in a number of different states had to abide by the pre-clearance rules. In 2013, in a decision called Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court struck down the particular part of the Voting Rights Act that set forth which jurisdictions, which states, which localities had to go through the pre-clearance process. So now we have pre-clearance on the books, but it doesn't operate anywhere. I've often seen it being described as what would happen if you had like this really strong, fast car and it had to stay on the lawn because nobody had the keys to make it work. And that's kind of what we're doing. So what happened when Shelby County? Well, for one, we saw a lot of states pass legislation that they probably wouldn't have bothered passing because pre-clearance would have stopped it. I'm thinking of the massive omnibus North Carolina law that ended up getting struck down by the Fourth Circuit. I'm thinking of the Texas photo ID bill, which had gotten stopped by the Department of Justice and then went into effect. I'm thinking of all of those changes that happened in Arizona in 2014, where they were consolidating election sites into voting centers and weren't thinking very carefully about how to do it such that the lines weren't very long, because one really neat thing that pre-clearance did was it guarded against both intentional discrimination and people just being sloppy because they weren't checking. Because in order to get through the pre-clearance, you had to affirmatively demonstrate that it wasn't going to make voters worse off. So it was a very good prophylactic measure, and we don't have it. A big other threat is there are forces at work in this country who are trying to go after another provision of the Voting Rights Act. That is Section 2. That is the nationwide coverage that says that any policy or practice that impedes an ability, a community of color's ability to elect a candidate of their choice is impermissible. Many of you signed on to a brief that we wrote in Brnovich, which is a case in which the Supreme Court is being asked to consider the scope of Section 2. If we are in a position where we don't have Section 5 operating and we don't have Section 2 operating, then people like me, who spend a lot of my time going into court to try and stop anti-voter activities, are going to have very, very, very few tools. These attacks on federal protections are occurring alongside a very real threat, which is a massive assault on the right to vote in the states. I'm sure you've seen the Brennan Center statistics that more than 47 states have introduced more than 361 pieces of legislation that would make it harder for people to participate and vote. We are updating those numbers in a matter of days. Those numbers will be higher, and we're going to be looking at who has actually passed these bills and which bills are still moving as we speak. These kinds of assaults on the right to vote are very broad in that there's not just like one step that people are taking. Like sometimes voter suppression techniques, follow trend lines where like there's a bunch of, voter ID bills, or there's a bunch of cutbacks on early voting. We're seeing a gamut of changes. A lot of them are going after vote by mail, but we're also seeing a lot of attacks on early in-person voting. We're seeing efforts to make it harder for election administrators to serve their voters. We're seeing courts being stripped of the authority to be able to regulate or to be able to step in when they think a legislature has gone too far. We're seeing big bills, we're seeing lots of small bills, we're seeing bills that are even compounding a bad problem. Like I'm from Texas, and I always just am scratching my head when Texas passes another voter suppression bill, because Texas already has a pretty closed system where it's already pretty hard to vote before compounding it by adding additional limits. So I think this attack in the states is not only an assault on the right to vote, it really is in many ways a cheapening of the political process, because we are seeing politicians do a lot of anti-democratic maneuvering to try and get bills through. We're seeing not the kind of a debate and discussion. We're seeing voters not being able to participate in meaningful ways in these debates. And we're seeing no policy justification for these in any sort of real way where you're having real problems that people are trying to solve. And the last big problem, I think, is this outsized role that the idea of voter fraud plays in our electorate. Study after study, after study, after study, after study indicates that it is highly rare, very, very unusual, statistically approaching zero in many ways, of the idea of a voter going in and trying to impermissibly cast a vote with the hope of trying to change the election outcome. What instead we see are people making mistakes. What instead we see are insiders abusing the system and what they know. And what we instead see are like administrative snafus that are irregularities that somehow people are morphing into and recasting, such that there's an intentionality and some sort of conspiracy. We saw a lot of this in the right after the election in terms of like, frivolous lawsuits being filed, trying to undermine the elections, no matter how many studies and independent audits and the like showed that there were that the election had gone off smoothly. We see politicians railing against the improprieties that happened, but I will tell you that nobody that won says that the outcome that caused them to win was illegitimate, right? It's always some other random fraud that occurred. It's never the one in which they won in. And we're also seeing at least some pushback on this because folks have stopped using the word voter fraud and started saying it's for election security, which is a disappointment, because election security was a phrase that most folks deemed relatively neutral when we were trying to guard against like hacking and stuff by cyber criminals. But now the idea of there being someone who may have died not getting pulled off the rolls is now being called an election security problem. And so I think all of those things together are doing a few things. One, it's really confusing the debate, because you can't actually get policy right if people aren't talking about facts in a thoughtful way. And if we aren't looking at the actual problems, it's hard to produce real solutions. Two, I think it's contributing to the polarization in our country, because it looks like it's very hard to reach any other conclusion other than there are some politicians willing to use the political process to try and get themselves a job security plan, because they're not actually trying to solve problems. And three, it is disgusting some voters, because people are thinking that, all politicians are in it for themselves. There's not actually some sort of nobility and debate and back and forth, and this is the policy making that we do. So what to do about this? I mean, I think there's big meta things and then there's small things. Like, I think the big meta thing is that we need to make the case every day, every single day, for a robust and participatory democracy. I think some of the fault of where we are right now lies at the feet of people like me, who kind of thought that we had won that battle, that we had gotten to a point in this country where people believed that our country is stronger when it hears from all of us, and that if we're going to resolve the challenges we face at the moment, that we need to leverage the talents and expertise and experience of all of the people in it, including those who are closest to the pain. When it's very, very clear to me that some of the other structural barriers or structural problems that we have allowed to continue are taking root. One of the things I'm thinking of is the fact that we don't teach civics in nearly as many high schools as we used to. And when people don't have a basic understanding of the process, it's very easy for charlatans and liars to go in and fill in the gaps between what they know and what they're hearing. The other big thing I think we need to do is force Congress to do its job and to do some more regulating. I think there's two big things that we can talk about. You guys have already heard, many of you have already heard me talk about the For the People Act, HR 1. It is an omnibus piece of legislation that includes many of the reforms, many reforms to many of the problems that we have seen in the last decade in elections. It covers a wide variety of issues ranging from voting to redistricting to ethics reforms to money and politics reforms. And it takes many of its pieces from best practices that we have seen in the states The other really big important one is restoring the Voting Rights Act to its full strength. There is a piece of legislation that is about to be introduced called the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which tries very hard to respond to what the court said we needed in terms of modernity and a modern formula in the Shelby County decision. And it comes up with a new way of trying to have Congress play a role in protecting against racial discrimination. It does a few big things that I want to leave you with before I wrap up. The first is that it restores a geographic coverage formula, which means if you have a certain number of violations, that jurisdiction will be subject to preclearance. It sets forth those practices, those things that we know in the past have been historically exploited against communities of color, and says that if you want to do one of those and you meet certain population thresholds, you're also going to have to go through preclearance. It sets forth notice to last minute changes that happen in an election, like moving a polling place. Shock among shocks, you'll have to tell people that you're moving the polling location. It sets out federal observers so that the federal government can go in and send boots on the ground to monitor and watch what's going on. And it changes the rules for when people like me can go into court and get like a standstill until we can figure it out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Myrna. Now let's turn to Larry.
Thank you, Didi. Well, let me begin by saying that even though I'm going to talk about electoral system reform and how to reduce polarization in the United States, I just can't endorse strongly enough everything that Myrna said, or thank effusively enough the Brennan Center for Justice for the absolutely amazing and vital work they're doing. And I just have to say, that I've spent my entire career, which is 40 years now past the PhD, studying democracy around the world. Why democracies succeed and fail. I'm a very boring person. That's essentially all I've done for 40 years as an academic. And we are dangerously close to losing democracy in the United States. If enough Republican legislatures succeed in enacting the provisions they have already enacted in a few states and are on their way to trying to do in others, to hijack electoral administration in the United States beyond all of the other voter suppression rules that Myrna was talking about, they may be able to do legally, at least in terms of judicial tolerance, what they were unable to do in 2024 or even 2022. What they were unable to do in 2020, what the courts would not let them do, which is reverse the outcome of a democratic election result. And if the people cannot choose their leaders in free and fair elections, you do not have a democracy. And we are dangerously close to not having a democracy in the United States of America. So one of the reasons why this is happening in the United States is because our political system is so polarized on partisan terms. Obviously, populism is another reason. The decay of civic education, which Myrna spoke about, is another reason. The polarizing impact of social media is another reason. But a big factor is the structural incentives that our system generates to polarization in the United States. And let me put it this way. Why did Bob Corker leave the Senate and retire a couple of years ago at the peak of his career? Why is Rob Portman retiring from the Senate seat in Ohio this year when he seems at the prime of his career? Why did Jeff Flake decide not to run for re-election, all of these being Republicans? I mean, we all know the reason, and it wasn't really that they'd lost their taste for politics in general, or frankly, their energy for public service. They came to the conclusion that they couldn't, at least without completely prostrating themselves to the anointed populist savior of America and his anti-democratic agenda, and without sacrificing their principles, that they would not be able to win a Republican primary to win renomination. They weren't worried about re-election. They were worried about renomination. And the way our political party system has come to work is that in order to be elected or re-elected, you first have to win a party primary election that is extremely low turnout, okay? You're lucky if you get 20% of voters, eligible voters, to vote in a party primary these days. And who are the voters who turn out in low turnout party primaries? They're generally the most ideologically committed and frankly, the most ideologically extreme Democrats and Republicans are the ones who are most intensely partisan and most likely to punish anyone who's thinking a little bit independently and isn't going along with the party line of the day. And this is what is locking our political system in a death spiral. Not only in competitive states like Arizona, but in one-party states like Alabama or Massachusetts, where, if you win the party primary, it's pretty much tantamount to election in the general election. And so you get the utter perversity of a pretty much professed QAnon follower, this lunatic and anti-Semite, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's equating mask wearing with the Holocaust, being elected to Congress, because once she wins a low turnout party primary, a Republican Party primary in a conservative district in Georgia, there's no competition in the general election. And this is an extremely perverse situation and extremely damaging for American democracy. But this is wedded to the other feature of the current American electoral system, which is first past the post. So once people are nominated in these low turnout party primaries, first of all, 45 states in the United States have something called the sore loser rule. So if you lose a party primary, you're not even allowed to have your name on the ballot in the general election and maybe offer voters another alternative there. And that further seals the fate of a kind of one-party election in the general election. And second of all, nobody but a Democrat or a Republican has really any chance of winning, because if you vote for an independent or a libertarian or a Green Party or any other political flavor you might imagine in a first past the post election, you're wasting your vote. Because if you're, if it's an innovation and a long shot for them to try and break into the mainstream of political competition, and you vote for them, but the two likeliest choices are Republican and Democrat, you're going to be throwing away your vote and possibly electing the candidate and party you least want to win, which is why so many elections at state levels, not to mention the occasional presidential election, that have had independent or third-party candidates melt back in the final weeks of election campaigns to this duopolistic two-party polarizing contest between, in the current context, increasingly polarized choices between Democrats and Republicans. I think that there is no way out of this death spiral of institutional incentives for hyper-partisanship and extreme polarization that doesn't change the electoral system in the United States. My conviction is, although I want to keep looking at it as a political scientist and evaluating the accumulating evidence, that by far the best hope we have is ranked choice voting, where in the general election you don't just vote for a single candidate, but you rank your choices, as you know, in San Francisco, Oakland, many other municipal elections in the United States, and now this will be used in September for the Democratic primary for city council and mayor in New York City. And, you can vote for an independent or a libertarian or Green Party candidate or whatever. And if nobody gets a majority of the vote, you haven't wasted your vote. Your vote will be transferred to your second choice. And these instant runoffs keep happening until somebody wins a majority of the votes that are cast. And to win a majority in a general election, you have to appeal to a broader electorate. And that's going to weed out some of these extreme candidates. Now imagine, to conclude, because my time is almost up, that we change the nature of primary elections. And instead of having these hyper-partisan primary elections that only draw the most ideologically committed voters, imagine that we had a blanket primary, a nonpartisan primary, and instead of choosing, as we do in California, a terrible mistake in my view, only 2 candidates to advance to the general election, we chose 4 or 5. This is called top 4 or top 5. And then you use ranked choice voting to choose among those top 4 or 5 in the general election. That would make it much more plausible that an independent in some cases, a libertarian in others, might actually make it into the general election and begin to erode the 2-party duopoly and create something that is missing in the current duopolistic situation, which is more creative and meaningful choice for voters and more incentive to appeal to broader sections of the electorate by the candidates who are competing. I will say in conclusion that top 4, the blanket primary advancing the top 4 candidates to the general election, is what the voters of Alaska adopted in November in a ballot initiative that has adopted the most creative political reform, I think, in the United States in probably 100 years. And this is why Lisa Murkowski has been rather emboldened in her voting behavior recently. Not that she isn't gutsier than most of her Republican colleagues, but she knows she's going to make it past that top 4-party primary, and she'll probably prevail in a kind of moderation affirming ranked choice voting general election. And top 5 is the proposal that the 2 great scholars of the American politics industry, Michael Porter of the Harvard Business School and Catherine Gell, one of his former students and a great American entrepreneur, have arrived at as their favored choice in their remarkable book, The Politics Industry. So, there is a grassroots campaign now to get electoral reform in the United States. It's starting to win in some places, not only cities, but Maine and Alaska, lost in Massachusetts. I think this is a viable reform, and I recommend it for your consideration.
Great, thank you, Larry. And finally, we have Anoop, who can discuss more practically what the business community can do, and he is a Stanford alum, just not a GSB alum.
Thanks, Didi. It's great to be with everyone. I think if that Larry and Myrna didn't fire you up, I don't know what will. So I'm glad you're recording this, because I'm going to play this as a motivation down the road here. But my name's Anoop Prakash. I am currently an executive at the Rev Group, which is a public company based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We manufacture ambulances, fire trucks, buses, and RVs. Prior to Rev, I was at Harley-Davidson for about 10 years. And earlier in my career, I spent 6 years in public service, 2 as a political appointee in the Bush administration and 4 as a Marine Corps officer. And as Didi mentioned, I'm a Stanford alum. from class of '95, and really happy to be here with you all. So, I think my perspective on this is going to be as a little bit of a business executive who has been fired up over the past few years and trying to find an outlet for that energy to make sure that we are participating more actively in the, democratic reform processes. And I think we've all seen and all experienced, those of you, who are here, most of you GSB grads or business executives, and you've all experienced kind of that, I would say almost that moat that exists between, our corporate life and what might be public life. And I don't think it's become even more stark when you hear Senator Mitch McConnell telling business leaders to mind their own business, that it's become even more stark. And boy, did that piss me off. Because, our business is as citizens, but also as corporate leaders, the people we lead, the institutions we lead, the organizations we lead, the resources we deploy. It is all about doing that responsibly and having an environment in which we can do that. And so I think there is a great amount of energy needed from the business community. And I guess what I wanted to talk about are just a few things that I've been able to do, to kind of engage in that process. Part of that passion that I've had led me to be a part of Leadership Now. And Leadership Now is a membership organization of business and thought leaders taking action to fix democracy. The goals are to advance evidence-based public policy, build an economy that works for everyone, and increase diversity in government. And today, Leadership Now has active membership in 6 cities and states and continues to grow nationally. And it is, the membership is largely former business leaders or current business leaders, I should say, many MBAs. It was founded by some of my classmates from HBS, and that's how I got drawn to it. And that has really given me kind of I guess an outlet or a platform in which to try to bring some of that to the state of Wisconsin where I live, which is a challenge in and of itself. But what I would like to talk about is, I guess, three areas of kind of what's been the roadmap in my mind to help more business leaders engage. And I think there are a few things that are kind of standing in our way. Some of those are contextual and historic, and how we've learned what our role is in relation to government. Some of it is related to our personal views on conduct of business executives and what we expect of them. And the third is really about how to engage locally. I mean, all politics are local, and there's a lot of engagement needed at the local level. And I'll share some examples of how we've done that. But I guess my first point was really about business education. I think we've all been indoctrinated to a degree. At least I certainly remember, my lessons reading Milton Friedman and all of the other great text about business's role in society and really the focus on shareholder value. And I know that's been drilled into our heads, but it's not only been drilled into our heads as MBAs from coastal schools, but it's actually been drilled into pretty much everyone I've worked with across the industrial Midwest, is that the business community should focus on creating jobs, focus on driving EBITDA, and leave everything else to everyone else. In fact, most executives you work with, and maybe some of you are among them, have very high degree of discomfort when it comes to talking about Washington, thinking about how their business interacts with Washington. And often that's outsourced to a government affairs shop that, sits in DC and is never seen from or heard from, at least not in the day-to-day course of business. And I think that, to me, is part of the challenge and part of the line that's been created. So one of the things that I really feel is important going forward is we have to reform business education and make the modern MBA, the modern executive, the modern organizational leader feel very comfortable getting their hands dirty and getting wet, mustering with government. And I think that's really an important part of it. All of the research, I remember when I was early in my career, I started off in a few different roles after business school, but then moved to the DC area selling to government. And I remember the as was my habit, I'd love to read books that would help me be a more effective executive working with the government. And almost all of the scholarship and all of the books that you find was all about how business leaders can manipulate government. It was about manipulation to achieve your selfish goals of your organization. And it was not about anything more to do with the broader role that democracy plays in supporting capitalism and supporting good business. So I think a lot of that change, and I think Professor Diamond mentioned Professor Porter and Catherine Gale's book, The Politics Industry. I think that goes a long way to create some academic baseline for political reform and how businesses can engage. I think the second thing that I would want to say around business education and business risk is we need to remove personal risk in your organizations, in all of our organizations, for executives who want to engage in political reform. I have found that there is a great deal of hesitation. Maybe, again, you can examine your own perspective on this, but for people to post actively on LinkedIn or other social media about how they truly feel about voting rights and other issues of democracy. And I think there is a lot of risk that people believe is out there that is personal risk within their organizations if they were to speak too loudly. Because our business profile is tied very much to our organization, our title on our page, where we work. And I have found when I have posted that I get a lot of responses from people I didn't expect to hear from, some positive, but many very negative. And so there is some risk, but we have to take away any sense that there's personal risk for that person to get active and be positive towards what they believe and towards democracy reform. I think it's important also in the sense that we would never accept that kind of retaliation inside of our organizations. So why would we allow that to happen if they were to speak out external to our organizations? And it's something we really have to think about changing the paradigm for. And then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about how do we engage at a local level. And the challenge that Leadership Now has or I should say the challenge before us at Leadership Now is to really create engagement at a local level. When you start something on the coasts and we do things at a national and federal level, it's not easy, but it's definitely easier to find like-minded people across the country. When you start getting into a state level engagement, working with state level business groups and business organizations, there's a lot more challenges. And I can tell you, certainly in Wisconsin, there is a very ingrained conservative business community that doesn't necessarily want to do anything but ask government to lower taxes and remove regulations. So a few things that we did in Wisconsin and that I would suggest is perhaps a little bit of a roadmap, and we're just getting started. But this spring, for example, we chaired a series of 3 events in Wisconsin where we convened business leaders to look at state level democracy issues. So topics like voting and gerrymandering were on the table. We had professors and election officials who actually carried out the elections present on those panels. We made sure we had representation from Wisconsin. So it was University of Wisconsin-Madison speakers, many of the election officials from Milwaukee and Madison, as well as others who had a hand in work in Wisconsin. And the key was that we were able to use those platforms as a way to educate. I think there was a big gap in, I think Myrna referred to the gap in civics education. I think many business leaders also are not always in tune with what's happening day to day. And I think we got a lot of real great detail from those speakers to really talk about what was happening that minute, in the Senate committees and in the House committees or in the Assembly committees in the state that we could get involved in. We also issued a business statement on elections that was a national statement from Leadership Now, over 200 signatures from CEOs and executives, including Reid Hoffman, Seth Klarman, Ben and Jerry, Marissa Meyer, received a lot of media coverage, and Leadership Now then worked with many of the trade groups and business associations on how we could communicate that statement to employees and customers during the election cycle. We've also engaged a number of MBA fellows in the Election Support Corps for Leadership Now. And we have those fellows working on different projects that are at the state level and supporting election officials, for example, during the election, and how to operationalize elections with the new procedures related to COVID. I think the last thing I'll mention is, getting engaged on op-eds. We have several partner portfolio organizations at Leadership Now that we work with. We've been able to work and collaborate with them to write some op-eds. And again, as business leaders, what we have value is we have stature in the community, we have credibility, we represent the business community, and we can lend our names to those op-eds. And I was able to co-write 2 op-eds on voting, which were published in the Capital Times and Wisconsin State Journal. And these were, really important, I think, for us to be able to put a business voice against the voice for political reform, especially when the chambers of commerce were not really willing to do so. So these are just some concrete examples. I know we'll talk more, but there's a lot of ways business leaders can take action, and certainly encourage all of you to, kind of move off the sidelines, find the steps that feel purposeful and impactful for you. And, I'll invoke, President Roosevelt, do what you can with what you have where you are. And I think that's exactly what we all have to do as business leaders while we're busy shepherding our own organizations. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Didi.
Great, thank you so much, Anoop, and thank you to these panelists. So we're going to, before I send any questions to the panelists, there's just one more polling question, which will help us sort of figure out another question we might ask. And that's whether corporations can corporations change their campaign donation or lobbying strategies without hurting their own interests? And this is to try to get at maybe some trade-offs in getting involved politically. But the first question is for Myrna, which is how it is pronounced. And that is, of the business solutions that Anoop discussed, with your experience working in both litigation and also legislation, when do you think that business activity can be the most impactful at either the state or the national level?
Well, I before I get to that, I want to say some of the particulars. I want to make sure that that business leaders know that the best way to be helpful is to make sure that they're staying on topic, because we get lots of requests for folks that almost make at least make me feel like I'm supposed to be helping them with their internal marketing and recruitment strategies, as opposed to actually trying to stop voting rights. So that means like actually naming bills, for one, not just talking broadly about the importance of democracy, like actually saying that X, Y, and Z are bad, X, Y, and Z are bad for business. That sort of thing, I think is one. It's just there's a way of authenticity and a way of being forthright about what's going on that is much more helpful than generic platitudes about the importance of democracy. The second thing is, it's part of it is what your experience or something in the state is. If you know a legislator, call the legislator. If you are a big employer in a state, make it be known that this is what you think, and put it in the op-ed, put it in an op-ed, testify in the legislature. There's many, many different steps, and there's many, many different places for an intervention. Some people are choosing to do like behind the scenes stuff, which is okay if it works. But I think, the big picture idea is there's lots of ways to be engaged, lots of ways that you can be helpful, but the specifics really, really, really matter. That way there's no mistaking among the legislators that are engaging in the anti-voter activity that you are talking about the particular actions they are trying to do. They can't hide behind some generic talking about that. And I do think making sure that folks are mindful of the fact that there are opportunity costs, right? And every time there's something from a business leader in a newspaper, there's probably a nonprofit group that's not going to be in the newspaper. So just make sure that you're actually packing the punch that that's going to be worth it.
Okay, we're going to head to breakout rooms soon, but before we do, I just have a question for Larry. which has to do with business financing of political candidates. So you spoke about the threat to democracy, especially by the Republican Party. Do you think that businesses can and should change their patterns of political giving? And if so, should it be to specific candidates or should it be to parties as a whole?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Look, I think that the most important thing I have to say is that we need institutional reform to modify the incentive structures. Beyond that, I would say a moderate amount of money can go a long ways in a party primary. And I wouldn't ignore party primaries. It matters who gets nominated, because then that, can really narrow the field thereafter. So that is certainly one lesson that I would draw for business, is not to ignore these party primary elections. And I would appeal to business. It sounds so naive and idealistic. I'm embarrassed to say it, that, beyond the positions that candidates take on particular issues that are of important interest to a business or an industry association, pay a little bit of attention to whether this candidate is, whether or not this candidate is, committed to minimum democratic principles, or by their rhetoric and their actions are so further polarizing and poisoning our political atmosphere that they are endangering, frankly, the business environment in which you operate, even if you think you might get a specific piece of legislation out of them that will, quote, be good for business.
Right. So we only have 5 minutes left, and there are some questions we didn't get to. It sounds like there's a lot of ideas on the table for how business can and should be more engaged. And as a sort of lightning round, and you are free to plug your own organization, I'm going to ask the panelists to name 1 or 2 organizations that they would recommend that everyone in this call who's interested in becoming more active get involved with in some way. And we'll start with you, Myrna.
I work with a lot of groups on the ground, and one that I'm really excited to be working with right now is a group called Texas Impact. It is an interfaith organization that works on a number of issues and has been really leading in a very authentic way on voting rights issues, making sure that congregations and the like are able to have their congregants be able to participate. So I think it's important to have that kind of diversity. And I will also say that they're doing a very, very good job, I think, of making sure that that the communities of color that are often forgotten in the state of Texas aren't forgotten. So I'm very excited to be working with Texas Impact.
That's great. All right, Larry, is he still here?
Yes.
All right.
The 2 most important political organizations I'm aware of, that is kind of civic organizations with some kind of mobilizational capacity to push electoral reform, are Represent Us, Represent US, and Unite America. I strongly recommend these. I've already praised the Brennan Center for Justice, Protect Democracy is another that I think is really working to defend democracy against very serious assaults on it. Common Cause has supported ranked choice voting in a number of states. Fair Vote is another longtime organizational champion of electoral reform for more choice and kind of inducing of depolarization.
Great, thank you. And lastly, but not least, Anoop.
Well, I will take your offer to plug Leadership Now project.
Yeah.
I think it's been a great home for MBAs and people who are completely immersed in their careers and cannot be full-time activists, but really assemble on key issues at the right time. I'll also mention Voting Rights Lab, which also has its sister arm, Secure Democracy. They do quite a bit of work specifically on voting rights, both on the sort of thought leadership side, but also the lobbying side, which is the Secure Democracy side of that group. And then I'll finally mention a fellow GSB alum who's a friend of mine, Jake Harriman, started a group recently called More Perfect Union. And it is really a strategic intervention in the election process, trying to raise enough money to put up Senate candidates who will commit to one term in the Senate and coalesce and form a coalition in the Senate, winning those elections and raise reforms in the Senate to be a beachhead for reform. So I'd encourage you to contribute to them. I've made my own contributions to Jake, and I think it's a noble way to go.
So finally, I just want to thank the GSB, especially the team of Allegria and Kathy who helped put this all together, Michael Gallagher, and our wonderful panelists, Myrna, Larry, and Anoop. Thank you for your insights today. And finally, thank you to all of you audience members who are being so active and engaged. Your voice and your time is critical on these issues, and we deeply appreciate it.